My husband Vincent threw me out of our Rosewood Heights home in a fit of rage, screaming that I was worthless and financially useless, completely unaware that I'd just inherited $47 million from my great-aunt's cryptocurrency empire. But Vincent forgot one crucial detail about the woman he'd been married to for 12 years. I'd been quietly building my own financial fortress while he thought I was just his dependent housewife. And now this man who dared to call me worthless is about to discover that his wife doesn't just have money. She has the power to reshape his entire world, starting with the mortgage company that holds his precious consulting firm's building, Lease. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. The sound of our mahogany front door slamming behind me still echoed in my ears as I stood on the pristine sidewalk of Elmhurst Drive at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. The autumn air bit through my hastily grabbed sweater as I clutched my purse and a single overnight bag, the only possessions Vincent had allowed me to take before he'd physically escorted me out of the house we'd called home for 8 years. "Get out, Sophia!" He'd screamed, his face twisted with the kind of fury I'd never seen before, veins bulging in his neck as he towered over me in our marble-floored foyer. "I'm done supporting a woman who contributes absolutely nothing to this household. You're a financial drain, a burden, and I want you gone." His words had been triggered by what he'd called my reckless spending, a $3,000 purchase I'd made that afternoon for what I'd described as investment research materials. What Vincent didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have understood in his rage-induced tirade, was that those materials were actually consultation fees I'd paid to cryptocurrency forensic accountants who were helping me unlock the final pieces of Great-Aunt Minerva's digital fortune. Great-Aunt Minerva Blackwood had been the family eccentric, the woman everyone whispered about at holiday gatherings. She'd lived alone in her sprawling estate in Willowbrook Manor, never married, always talking about digital gold and blockchain revolutionaries in ways that made the rest of our family exchange knowing glances and change the subject. When she'd passed away 6 months ago at the age of 89. Most of the family had expected her to leave behind nothing but debt and cryptocurrency conspiracy theories. But Minerva had been far more brilliant than any of us realized. The reading of her will had been a shock to everyone, especially the revelation that she'd named me, her youngest great-niece who'd actually listened to her stories about digital currencies, as the sole beneficiary of what the lawyers had described as substantial cryptocurrency holdings and related digital assets. The problem was that Minerva had been so paranoid about security that she'd scattered her digital fortune across 17 different blockchain networks, protected by encryption keys that she'd hidden in riddles, artwork, and coded messages throughout her estate. For the past 6 months, while Vincent had been building his consulting empire and treating me like an expensive pet who contributed nothing to our household income, I'd been working with a team of blockchain forensic specialists, cryptography experts, and digital asset recovery professionals to piece together Minerva's financial puzzle. Every day, while Vincent was at his office managing his precious clients, I'd been conducting video conferences with specialists in Estonia, Singapore, and Switzerland, slowly unlocking wallet after wallet of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrencies that Minerva had accumulated over 15 years of what everyone had thought was eccentric rambling about digital money. The final breakthrough had come just 3 days ago. The last encryption key had been discovered hidden in the frame of a painting Minerva had left me, a seemingly worthless abstract piece that had actually contained a QR code visible only under ultraviolet light. When that final wallet opened, revealing holdings worth $12.7 million in a cryptocurrency called Stellar Lumens, my total inheritance had crystallized at exactly $47,312,147 million. $312,847. And Vincent, the man who'd spent 12 years explaining my financial limitations to me, who'd controlled our household budget with an iron fist, who'd made me ask permission for purchases over $50, had just thrown me out of our house for being financially worthless. The irony was so perfect, it would have been funny if it weren't so devastatingly personal. As I stood on that sidewalk, watching the lights go out in our bedroom window as Vincent presumably went to sleep, satisfied with his decision to eliminate his financial burden, I realized that this moment would define the rest of both our lives. Vincent had made a choice based on the assumption that I was powerless, dependent, and disposable. He'd gambled our entire marriage on the belief that I had nowhere to go and no resources to challenge his dominance. But Vincent had made one critical miscalculation. The woman he'd just thrown out wasn't the financially dependent housewife he thought he'd married. She was someone who now controlled more liquid assets than his consulting firm would generate in 50 years. Someone who'd spent months learning about international finance, cryptocurrency markets, and digital wealth management from some of the most sophisticated financial minds in the world. Vincent thought he'd solved his problem by eliminating what he saw as dead weight from his life. Instead, he'd just declared war on someone who now had the resources to fight back in ways he couldn't even imagine. Tomorrow morning, while Vincent was drinking his coffee and congratulating himself on his decisive action, I would begin showing him exactly what it meant to underestimate Sophia Blackwood. The woman who'd inherited not just money, but the wisdom to use it strategically. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. And Vincent was about to learn that some lessons come with a price tag of $47 million. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you. So if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. All right, let's get back to it. I spent that first night in the Grandview Hotel on Morrison Boulevard, lying awake in the crisp white sheets of a suite that cost more per night than Vincent allowed me to spend on groceries in a month. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now wealthy enough to buy the entire hotel chain. Yet here I was, displaced from my own home by a man who thought he was punishing me for being financially dependent. As dawn broke over Rosewood Heights, I began to truly understand the scope of what Vincent had done. This wasn't just about one night of explosive anger. This was the culmination of 12 years of systematic financial control that I'd been too trusting, too accommodating, to recognize as abuse. Vincent Calloway had been 28 when we'd met at a corporate networking event in downtown Millbrook City. I was fresh out of graduate school with my master's in art history, working as a curator's assistant at the prestigious Whitmore Museum. Vincent was already building his reputation as a management consultant, charming and confident, with an MBA from Thornfield University and big plans for his own firm. During our courtship, his financial acumen had seemed like strength. When he'd suggested we keep separate bank accounts initially for simplicity, I'd agreed. When he'd offered to handle our joint expenses because he understood money better, I'd been grateful. When he'd gradually taken over more and more of our financial decisions, explaining complex investment strategies and tax implications that seemed beyond my artistic mind, I'd felt protected. What I'd failed to recognize was that Vincent hadn't been protecting me. He'd been isolating me. Over 12 years of marriage, Vincent had constructed an elaborate system that kept me financially dependent while making me believe it was for my own good. He'd convinced me that my part-time work at various art galleries was more of a hobby than a career, and that it made more sense for me to focus on supporting his growing business rather than pursuing my own professional advancement. When Calloway Strategic Consulting had started generating serious revenue 5 years ago, Vincent had insisted that my unpredictable artistic income made it impossible to qualify for the kind of loans and credit lines his business needed. So we'd structured everything, our mortgage, his business loans, our investment accounts, around his income alone. I'd signed documents that Vincent had explained were protecting our assets, never realizing that the legal language actually removed me from ownership of nearly everything we'd built together. Our house on me. Elmhurst Drive, The beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with the wraparound porch that I'd fallen in love with was solely in Vincent's name. He'd explained that my irregular employment history would complicate the mortgage application, and that it was simpler to have everything under his stable business credit. I'd trusted him completely. The cars, the investment accounts, even the credit cards I used for daily expenses, all controlled by Vincent, all requiring his approval for any significant purchases. He'd given me an allowance of $800 per month for personal expenses, explaining that this was more than sufficient for someone who didn't need to worry about real financial responsibilities. But Vincent's most masterful manipulation had been psychological. He'd gradually convinced me that I was bad with money, that my artistic temperament made me impractical about financial matters, that I should be grateful to have a husband who was financially responsible enough for both of us. When I'd occasionally questioned his decisions or suggested that I might want more input into our financial planning, he'd responded with patient condescension, explaining why my ideas weren't practical, and reminding me of past purchases he'd deemed irresponsible. The $3,000 expenditure that had triggered Tuesday night's explosion was the perfect example of Vincent's control system in action. I'd needed to pay a blockchain forensic specialist to help decode the final pieces of Aunt Minerva's cryptocurrency puzzle. But because Vincent controlled all our accounts, I'd had to use one of the credit cards he monitored to make the payment. When the charge had appeared on his phone notifications, Vincent had called me immediately, his voice tight with the controlled anger I'd learned to fear. "Sophia, what the hell is this charge for digital asset recovery solutions? $3,000? Without discussing it with me first?" I'd tried to explain about Aunt Minerva's inheritance, about the cryptocurrency research I'd been conducting, about the progress I was making in unlocking what could be substantial assets. But Vincent had cut me off with the dismissive tone he'd perfected over years of financial dominance. "Cryptocurrency is a scam, Sophia. Your crazy aunt was obviously delusional about whatever she thought she had, and you're being taken advantage of by con artists who prey on people like you. I'm canceling this payment immediately." But the payment had already been processed, and the forensic specialist had already provided the breakthrough information I'd needed. When Vincent had arrived home that evening, still furious about what he'd seen as my financial irresponsibility, I'd tried to show him the documentation proving that Aunt Minerva's inheritance was real. Vincent had barely glanced at the papers before exploding into the rage that had ended with me standing on our sidewalk at midnight with a suitcase. "I don't care what these fake documents say," he'd screamed. "You've been wasting our money on fantasy nonsense while I've been working 16-hour days to build something real. You're financially delusional, Sophia, and I won't let you drag down everything I've built." Now, sitting in my hotel suite as the morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Vincent's pattern of control with perfect clarity. He'd spent 12 years systematically undermining my financial confidence while building a system that made me completely dependent on his approval and support. But Vincent had made one catastrophic error in his calculations. He'd been so focused on controlling the money he could see, our joint accounts, our household budget, our shared assets, that he'd never bothered to investigate the money he couldn't see. In 6 months of working with cryptocurrency specialists, I'd learned more about international finance, digital asset management, and wealth preservation strategies than Vincent had ever imagined I was capable of understanding. I'd developed relationships with financial advisors in 3 countries and had been educated by some of the most sophisticated minds in emerging financial technologies. Vincent thought he'd thrown out a financially helpless woman who couldn't survive without his support. Instead, he'd liberated someone who now controlled more liquid wealth than he could earn in multiple lifetimes. And as I sipped my room service coffee and opened my laptop to begin the next phase of my plan, I realized that Vincent's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating my inheritance. It was underestimating my capacity to learn exactly how to use it. By 9 a.m. Wednesday morning, I was sitting in the private client suite of Meridian Wealth Management on Kensington Avenue, across from Elena Rodriguez, one of the most respected private wealth advisors on the East Coast. Helena had been recommended by my cryptocurrency forensic team as someone who specialized in complex inheritance situations requiring discretion. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on either of us. While Vincent was probably drinking his morning coffee and checking his business accounts, assuming I was somewhere crying about my financial helplessness, I was actually sitting in a mahogany-paneled office worth more than most people's homes, discussing investment strategies for a fortune that dwarfed anything Vincent had ever imagined. "Mrs. Calloway," Helena said, her silver hair perfectly styled as she reviewed the documentation I'd brought. "What you've inherited is extraordinary, but what's even more remarkable is how methodically your great-aunt structured these holdings." She wasn't just collecting cryptocurrency randomly. She was building a diversified digital portfolio that spans 15 different blockchain technologies. Helena spread the asset breakdown across her glass desk like pieces of a financial puzzle. Bitcoin holdings worth $18.2 million, Ethereum investments totaling $12.8 million, various altcoins and emerging technologies that added another $16.3 million to the total. But what made Aunt Minerva's strategy truly sophisticated was her timing. "Your great-aunt began accumulating these positions in 2009, Helena continued, pointing to transaction records that showed Minerva's prescient investment decisions. She bought Bitcoin when it was trading for less than $1. She identified Ethereum during its initial development phase. She recognized Chainlink's potential before most institutional investors had heard of Oracle networks. The documentation painted a picture of a woman who'd been 15 years ahead of the financial curve. While everyone else had dismissed cryptocurrency as internet monopoly money, Minerva had been systematically building positions in technologies that would eventually revolutionize global finance. But Helena's next revelation changed everything I thought I knew about my inheritance. "Mrs. Calloway, there's something else your great-aunt left you that the initial estate evaluation missed," Helena said, pulling out a sealed envelope marked with my name in Minerva's distinctive handwriting. "This arrived by courier this morning from her estate attorney. Apparently, it was only to be released after you'd successfully accessed the cryptocurrency holdings." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter that made my hands tremble as I read Minerva's words. "Dearest Sophia, if you're reading this, then you've proven yourself worthy of understanding what I've really left you. The cryptocurrency was just the beginning. What I've actually bequeathed to you is something far more powerful, the knowledge and connections to build generational wealth that no one can ever take away from you." The letter continued with details that made my breath catch. Minerva hadn't just been a cryptocurrency investor. She'd been an angel investor in blockchain technology companies, holding equity positions in 17 different startups that were now worth hundreds of millions. She'd been a silent partner in 3 cryptocurrency exchanges. She'd owned real estate in blockchain technology hubs across 4 countries. But the most shocking revelation was the business network Minerva had built. She'd maintained relationships with cryptocurrency developers, blockchain venture capitalists, and digital asset managers across the globe. People who'd known her not as an eccentric old woman, but as a visionary investor who'd identified transformative technologies decades before mainstream adoption. "Your great-aunt," Helena explained, was something of a legend in cryptocurrency circles. She was known as the Oracle of Willowbrook among digital asset professionals. Her investment recommendations were sought after by people who managed billions in traditional and digital assets. The letter included contact information for Minerva's financial network, venture capital firms in Silicon Valley that were launching cryptocurrency funds, blockchain technology companies looking for strategic investors, and international wealth management groups that specialized in digital asset preservation across multiple jurisdictions. As Helena and I spent the next 2 hours developing a strategy for managing my inheritance, I realized that Vincent's financial control had been built on a fundamental misconception. He'd assumed that financial sophistication required traditional business education and corporate experience. He'd never considered that there were entirely new categories of wealth being created by people who understood emerging technologies. While Vincent had been building his consulting practice around conventional business strategies, I'd been educated by experts who were reshaping the global financial system. His expertise was rooted in industrial-age thinking about money and wealth. Mine was now anchored in technologies that were making traditional financial institutions scramble to stay relevant. But the most valuable aspect of my education hadn't been technical knowledge about blockchain protocols or cryptocurrency markets. It had been learning to think strategically about power, influence, and long-term planning. The forensic specialists who'd helped me unlock Minerva's inheritance had taught me how to trace financial relationships, understand complex legal structures, and identify vulnerabilities in other people's financial arrangements. By noon, Helena and I had established a comprehensive plan for my financial independence: new bank accounts in 3 different countries, investment vehicles that would generate passive income exceeding Vincent's annual business revenue, legal structures that would protect my assets from any attempt Vincent might make to claim community property rights. But more importantly, we'd identified Vincent's financial vulnerabilities with the precision of a forensic accountant. Helena's research team had spent the morning investigating Callaway Strategic Consulting's financial structure, and what they'd discovered was fascinating. Vincent's business, which he'd portrayed as a thriving consulting empire, was actually heavily leveraged and dependent on a small number of major clients. His commercial lease for the prestigious Riverside office complex was personally guaranteed, meaning his personal assets were at risk if his business revenue declined. Even more interesting was Vincent's recent expansion strategy. 6 months ago, he'd taken out substantial loans to lease additional office space and hire 3 new consultants, betting that his client base would continue growing. But Helena's team had identified signs that Vincent's largest client, Pemberton Industries, was considering switching to a larger consulting firm based in the state capital. Vincent's financial confidence was built on assumptions about continued business growth and stable client relationships. He'd structured his entire lifestyle around projected revenue that depended on factors beyond his control. In contrast, my inheritance was diversified across technologies, currencies, and geographic regions. Even if cryptocurrency markets experienced significant volatility, I would still control more stable wealth than Vincent could accumulate in his lifetime. As I left Meridian Wealth Management that afternoon, I realized that my education in financial independence had prepared me for something Vincent had never anticipated: asymmetric warfare. He'd kicked me out believing he held all the financial power in our relationship. He'd assumed that I would be forced to return, contrite and dependent, begging for his forgiveness and financial support. Instead, I now had the resources to investigate every aspect of Vincent's business and personal finances, to understand his vulnerabilities better than he understood them himself, and to make strategic decisions that would reshape both our futures. Vincent thought he'd eliminated a financial burden from his life. He'd actually declared war on someone who now had more sophisticated financial intelligence and substantially more resources than he'd ever possessed. And tomorrow, while Vincent was conducting his business meetings and managing his leveraged consulting practice, I would begin showing him exactly what it meant to underestimate someone who'd learned to think several moves ahead. Thursday. Morning brought a phone call that would change everything I thought I knew about my own capabilities. Dr. Marcus Chen, a blockchain forensic specialist from Singapore, contacted me with information that transformed my understanding of what Aunt Minerva had actually left me. Mrs. Callaway, Dr. Chen's voice carried an excitement that was unusual for someone who typically dealt with the dry technical aspects of cryptocurrency recovery. We've completed the deep analysis of your great-aunt's wallet structures, and what we've discovered goes far beyond simple cryptocurrency holdings. Your great-aunt wasn't just an investor. She was a pioneer who helped create some of the most important blockchain technologies being used today. I was sitting in my hotel suite, still processing Helena's revelations from the previous day, when Dr. Chen's words forced me to completely reconsider everything I thought I knew about Minerva's legacy. The additional documentation he'd uncovered painted a picture of a woman who'd been not just prescient about cryptocurrency adoption, but instrumental in developing the technologies themselves. Your great-aunt holds founding patents on 3 critical blockchain technologies, Dr. Chen continued, his voice growing more animated as he shared his discoveries. She was part of the original development team that created smart contract architecture for the Ethereum network. She holds intellectual property rights for consensus mechanisms that are now used by 14 different cryptocurrency platforms. Most significantly, she owns licensing rights for quantum-resistant encryption protocols that every major blockchain platform will need to implement over the next 5 years. The implications of what Dr. Chen was explaining hit me like a physical orza. Minerva hadn't just bought cryptocurrency early and gotten lucky. She'd helped invent the fundamental technologies that made modern blockchain systems possible, and she'd been strategic enough to protect her contributions with patents and licensing agreements that generated ongoing revenue streams. Dr. Chen, I managed, my voice barely steady. What does this mean in practical terms? It means your great-aunt's estate generates approximately $2.3 million per month in patent licensing fees from cryptocurrency companies worldwide. These payments are automatic, contractually guaranteed, and will continue for the next 12 years based on existing licensing agreements. But more importantly, as quantum computing advances threaten current encryption methods, her quantum-resistant protocols will become essential for every blockchain platform's survival. I set down my coffee cup with trembling hands as Dr. Chen continued explaining the technical details. Minerva had anticipated that quantum computing would eventually render current blockchain encryption vulnerable, so she'd spent years developing mathematical solutions that could protect digital assets from quantum attacks. These weren't theoretical concepts. They were proven technologies that blockchain platforms were already licensing for future implementation. But the revelation that truly changed everything was what Dr. Chen discovered when he analyzed the legal structures Minerva had created around her intellectual property. She hadn't just filed patents in the United States. She'd established a complex international framework that protected her technologies across 47 countries, with licensing agreements that escalated in value as adoption increased. Mrs. Calloway, your great-aunt created what can only be described as a cryptocurrency royalty empire. Every time someone uses a blockchain platform that incorporates her consensus mechanisms, your estate receives micropayments. As cryptocurrency adoption expands globally, these payments increase exponentially. The financial projections Dr. Chen shared were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that patent licensing revenue alone would generate between $400 million and $1.2 billion over the next decade, depending on cryptocurrency adoption rates. But if quantum computing threats accelerated the need for Minerva's quantum-resistant protocols, the licensing value could exceed $5 billion. I realized I was holding my breath as Dr. Chen explained the final piece of Minerva's strategy. She'd structured all of these intellectual property rights through a Cayman Islands trust that I now controlled completely. The trust was designed to minimize tax obligations while maximizing flexibility for licensing negotiations and strategic partnerships. Your great-aunt, Dr. Chen concluded, didn't just leave you wealth, she left you control of technologies that will be essential for the future of digital finance. You're not just a cryptocurrency inheritor, Mrs. Calloway. You're now one of the most significant intellectual property holders in the blockchain technology sector. After ending the call with Dr. Chen, I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd inherited. Vincent had spent 12 years treating me like someone incapable of understanding complex financial concepts, while I'd unknowingly inherited intellectual property rights that made me a central figure in the global transformation of money itself. But, as the shock wore off, something else took its place, a profound understanding of the strategic position I now occupied. This wasn't just about having money. This was about controlling technologies that every major financial institution, government, and cryptocurrency platform would eventually need to license. I called Helena Rodriguez immediately to share Dr. Chen's discoveries and discuss the implications for my financial strategy. When I finished explaining the patent portfolio and licensing agreements, Helena's usual professional composure cracked into something approaching amazement. "Sophia," she said, her voice carrying a note of reverence I'd never heard from a financial advisor, "what you've inherited isn't just wealth. It's influence over the future direction of global finance. The quantum-resistant protocols alone make you someone that central banks and governments will need to negotiate with as they develop digital currencies." Helena's analysis of my new position was both thrilling and sobering. I controlled technologies that were already generating massive revenue streams, but more importantly, I controlled innovations that would become increasingly valuable as the world's financial systems continued digitalizing. "The question now," Helena continued, "isn't how to manage your inheritance. It's how to leverage your position to build something that extends far beyond personal wealth. You have the opportunity to influence how blockchain technology develops, which companies succeed in the cryptocurrency space, and how quickly quantum-resistant protocols are adopted globally." As Helena spoke, I realized that Vincent's greatest miscalculation hadn't been underestimating my financial resources. He'd fundamentally misunderstood what intelligence and capability looked like. He'd assumed that business acumen required traditional, corporate experience and conventional financial education. But Vincent had never considered that there were entirely new categories of expertise being developed by people who understood emerging technologies. While he'd been perfecting traditional consulting methodologies, I'd been inadvertently positioned at the center of the most significant financial transformation in human history. Vincent had thrown me out for being financially irresponsible, based on a $3,000 expenditure that had actually helped me unlock control of technologies worth potentially billions of dollars. He'd called me worthless while I was unknowingly inheriting intellectual property rights that made me more financially influential than anyone in our city. The man who'd spent 12 years explaining my financial limitations to me had just discovered that his wife didn't just have money. She had the power to reshape entire industries, and Vincent had absolutely no idea what he'd unleashed. Friday morning, I hired Blackstone Investigations, the most discreet private investigation firm in the tri-state area, to conduct what their lead investigator, Rebecca Torres, called a comprehensive financial and personal audit of Vincent's life. What they discovered over the next 72 hours would provide me with leverage I'd never imagined possible. "Mrs. Calloway," Rebecca said during our Monday morning meeting in her downtown office, "your husband's life is far more complicated than he's led you to believe. What we've uncovered suggests that his decision to remove you from your home may have been motivated by factors beyond simple anger about your spending." Rebecca spread a series of documents across her conference table, like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a side of Vincent I'd never seen. Bank statements, credit reports, business filings, and communication records that painted a picture of a man whose carefully constructed image was hiding significant problems. "Let's start with Callaway Strategic Consulting," Rebecca continued, pointing to financial records that made my stomach clench. "Your husband's business is in serious financial trouble. He's been operating at a loss for the past 8 months, using business credit lines to cover operating expenses and borrowing against future contracts to pay current obligations." The documentation Rebecca had obtained through legal channels showed that Vincent's consulting empire was built on financial quicksand. The prestigious Riverside office complex lease that he'd used to impress clients was costing him $12,000 per month, plus utilities and maintenance fees that brought his monthly overhead to nearly $18,000. But his actual revenue had been declining steadily since his largest client, Pemberton Industries, had begun reducing their consulting budget 6 months earlier. "Your husband has been using personal credit cards to cover business expenses," Rebecca explained, showing me statements that revealed the scope of Vincent's financial desperation. "He's accumulated over $89,000 in high-interest debt across 7 different credit cards. The minimum payments alone are consuming more than half of his actual monthly income. But the financial pressures were only part of what Rebecca had discovered. The investigation had revealed that Vincent's professional reputation was also under threat from a direction he'd never mentioned to me. "Mrs. Calloway, are you familiar with a company called Advanced Analytics Solutions?" Rebecca asked, sliding another set of documents across the table. I shook my head, though something about the name seemed vaguely familiar from conversations Vincent had dismissed as unimportant. Advanced Analytics is a larger consulting firm, based in Sterling Heights, that's been systematically targeting your husband's clients, Rebecca continued. They've hired away 2 of his junior consultants in the past 4 months, and they've been offering Pemberton Industries consulting services at rates that are 40% below what your husband charges. The competitive pressure Vincent was facing was far more intense than he'd ever admitted. Advanced Analytics wasn't just competing for the same clients. They were actively recruiting Vincent's employees and undercutting his pricing with the goal of forcing him out of the market entirely. Your husband has been engaging in what can only be described as desperate business practices to maintain his client relationships, Rebecca said, producing email communications that made me understand why Vincent had been so stressed and irritable. In recent months, he's been offering services at below-cost rates, extending payment terms that strain his cash flow, and making promises about deliverables that his current staff capacity cannot realistically fulfill. But Rebecca's most disturbing discovery was evidence that Vincent had been hiding his financial problems by manipulating the household budget in ways I'd never detected. He'd been using money from our joint savings account to cover business expenses, then replacing it with cash advances from business credit cards to avoid detection. Your husband has been essentially robbing your household finances to keep his business afloat, Rebecca explained, showing me transaction records that revealed a complex shell game Vincent had been playing with our money. Over the past 6 months, he's moved approximately $47,000 from your joint accounts into business operations, then covered the transfers with borrowed money that's now part of his business debt obligations. The realization that Vincent had been stealing from our household finances while lecturing me about financial responsibility was infuriating, but Rebecca's next revelation was even more shocking. "Mrs. Calloway, we also discovered evidence that your husband has been consulting with a divorce attorney," Rebecca said, producing photographs of Vincent entering the law offices of Morrison, Webb and Associates 3 weeks before our explosive confrontation. Based on the timing of these meetings and the financial pressures he's been facing, it appears that removing you from your home may have been part of a premeditated strategy. The documentation Rebecca had obtained suggested that Vincent had been planning to end our marriage for months, but he'd been waiting for the right moment to maximize his financial advantage. The divorce attorney he'd consulted specialized in cases where one spouse had significantly higher income than the other, and their strategy typically involved establishing grounds for claiming that the lower-earning spouse had contributed to marital financial problems. Your husband's explosive reaction to your $3,000 expenditure may have been calculated rather than spontaneous, Rebecca continued. By characterizing your spending as financially irresponsible and removing you from the home, he was creating documentation that could support claims that you were a financial liability in the marriage. The investigation had revealed that Vincent's plan was sophisticated and ruthless. He'd intended to use my supposed financial incompetence as grounds for limiting any alimony obligations, while positioning himself as the responsible spouse who'd been financially damaged by my poor decisions. But Vincent's strategy contained a fundamental flaw that he couldn't have anticipated. His timeline had been accelerated by his own financial desperation, and he'd acted before he understood what he was actually dealing with. Rebecca's team had also investigated Vincent's personal relationships and discovered evidence that his business stress was affecting more than just his professional performance. He'd been drinking more heavily than usual, his temper had become increasingly volatile with employees and clients, and several business associates had privately expressed concerns about his judgment and reliability. Your husband's decision to remove you from your home appears to have been driven by a combination of financial panic, professional pressure, and poor strategic planning, Rebecca concluded. He's been facing multiple crises simultaneously, and his response has been to make increasingly desperate decisions without considering long-term consequences. As I reviewed all the evidence Rebecca had compiled, I realized that Vincent's betrayal was even more systematic than I'd initially understood. He hadn't just kicked me out in a moment of anger. He'd been planning to destroy our marriage while stealing from our joint finances and hiding the scope of his business failures. But Vincent had made one critical miscalculation in his elaborate strategy. He'd assumed that I was actually the financially dependent, intellectually limited person he'd been treating me as for 12 years. His entire plan was based on the premise that I would be helpless to respond effectively to his manipulations. Vincent had no idea that the woman he'd thrown out was now capable of hiring investigators more sophisticated than any he could afford, accessing financial resources that dwarfed his business problems, and understanding strategic planning at a level that made his desperate schemes look amateur by comparison. The man who'd been systematically planning to financially destroy me was about to discover that he'd declared war on someone who now had the resources to investigate every aspect of his life and respond with precision that would make his problems seem insignificant compared to what was coming next. Tuesday brought a revelation that transformed Vincent's betrayal from personal cruelty into criminal fraud. My forensic accountant, David Kim from Precision Financial Auditing, called me with findings that would change everything about how I understood my marriage and Vincent's recent behavior. Mrs. Calloway, David's voice carried the gravity of someone who'd uncovered evidence of serious financial crimes. What we've discovered goes far beyond business mismanagement. Your husband has been committing systematic fraud, and you've been the primary victim of his criminal activities. I was in my hotel suite reviewing Rebecca Torres's investigation files when David's call forced me to confront a reality I'd never imagined. Over the past week, David's team had been analyzing our joint financial accounts, tax filings, and business records with the thoroughness of federal investigators. What they'd found was evidence of financial crimes that extended back 3 years. Your husband has been filing fraudulent tax returns that misrepresent your household income and financial obligations, David continued, his tone becoming more serious as he detailed his discoveries. He's been claiming business expenses for personal purchases, inflating his business losses to reduce tax liability, and most significantly, he's been forging your signature on documents that affect your legal and financial standing. The documentation David had compiled was devastating. Vincent had been signing my name to tax documents, loan applications, and financial agreements without my knowledge or consent. In some cases, he'd created financial obligations that I was legally responsible for, despite having no knowledge of their existence. Mrs. Calloway, your husband has taken out 3 separate business loans totaling $127,000 using your credit and signature, David explained, pulling up records that made my hands shake. These loans are secured by liens on your personal assets, including your art collection and jewelry. If his business fails, creditors can legally seize your possessions to recover the debt. The systematic nature of Vincent's fraud was breathtaking. He hadn't just been hiding financial problems. He'd been actively transferring his business risks to me through forged documents and fraudulent financial representations. Every loan application, every credit line, every business agreement had been structured to protect Vincent's personal assets while exposing mine to potential seizure. But David's most disturbing discovery involved our retirement accounts and investment portfolios. Vincent had been moving money from my individual retirement account into high-risk business investments without authorization, then using the losses to claim tax deductions that reduced our household tax liability. Your husband has essentially been using your retirement savings as a business slush fund, David continued, showing me transaction records that revealed the scope of Vincent's theft. Over the past 18 months, he's transferred $83,000 from TAI, your IRA, into failed business ventures, then claimed the losses as legitimate business expenses on your joint tax returns. The financial fraud was criminal. But David's investigation had also uncovered evidence that Vincent had been manipulating our household finances in ways that went beyond simple theft. He'd been creating artificial financial emergencies that justified his increasing control over our budget and spending decisions. Your husband has been manufacturing crises to justify restricting your financial independence, David explained, producing bank statements that showed a pattern of suspicious transactions. He would create artificial shortfalls in your joint accounts by moving money to business expenses, then use these manufactured financial problems to argue that household spending needed to be reduced and more tightly controlled. The psychological manipulation was as systematic as the financial fraud. Vincent had been using his control of our finances to create the appearance that our household was under financial stress, then using that manufactured stress to justify treating me like someone who couldn't be trusted with money. But David's most shocking discovery involved Vincent's insurance policies and estate planning documents. Without my knowledge, Vincent had altered our life insurance beneficiaries and modified our wills to ensure that if anything happened to me, all our assets would transfer to him with minimal legal complications. Mrs. Calloway, your husband has been systematically positioning himself to inherit everything you own while protecting his assets from your potential claims, David said, his voice carrying implications that made me feel physically sick. The documents he's filed suggest that he's been planning for a scenario where you might be removed from the financial picture entirely. The estate planning modifications Vincent had made were particularly sinister because they'd been filed during the same period when he'd been accumulating massive business debts and facing increasing professional pressure. It appeared that Vincent had been preparing for the possibility that his business failures might require more drastic solutions than simple divorce proceedings. David's team had also discovered evidence that Vincent had been researching asset protection strategies, typically used by people facing potential criminal prosecution or civil liability. He'd been consulting with attorneys who specialized in hiding assets from creditors and regulatory authorities. Your husband has been implementing financial strategies that suggest he anticipated needing to disappear substantial assets quickly, David continued, showing me legal documents that Vincent had filed in Delaware and Nevada. These structures are typically used by people who expect to face serious legal or financial consequences for their actions. The revelation that Vincent had been preparing for potential criminal prosecution explained why his reaction to my $3,000 expenditure had been so violent and irrational. He'd been operating under enormous pressure, knowing that his fraudulent activities were becoming increasingly difficult to hide, and my unexpected involvement with financial professionals had triggered panic about exposure. But Vincent's most critical error had been assuming that I was too financially naive to understand what he'd been doing, or too resource-limited to respond effectively. His entire fraud scheme had been designed around the premise that I would never discover his crimes or develop the capability to fight back. David's investigation had also revealed that Vincent's financial crimes had affected other people beyond our household. He'd been misrepresenting his business's financial health to clients, taking deposits for services he couldn't deliver, and using new client payments to fulfill obligations to existing clients in what amounted to a Ponzi scheme. Structure. Your husband's business model has become unsustainable and potentially criminal, David concluded. He's been operating essentially as a financial pyramid scheme, using new contracts to pay for previous commitments while accumulating debt that he's been transferring to your personal financial responsibility. The scope of Vincent's crimes was staggering, but what made his situation truly desperate was the timeline David had identified. Several of Vincent's clients had begun asking questions about delayed deliverables and cost overruns. His largest client, Pemberton Industries, had initiated an audit of their consulting expenses that could expose the fraudulent billing practices Vincent had been using to inflate his revenue. "Mrs. Calloway," David said, his voice carrying the weight of professional certainty, "your husband's financial crimes are about to be exposed regardless of any action you take. The question is whether you want to be positioned as a victim of his fraud or continue to be legally entangled with his criminal activities." As I reviewed all the evidence David had compiled, I realized that Vincent's decision to throw me out hadn't been motivated by anger about my spending. It had been a desperate attempt to distance himself from someone who might become a witness to his criminal activities. Vincent had been systematically stealing from me, forging my signature and using my assets to secure loans for fraudulent business activities. But his most catastrophic mistake had been assuming that the woman he'd been victimizing for 3 years would remain helpless when she finally discovered what he'd been doing. Vincent had no idea that his victim now controlled financial resources and professional expertise that would make his fraud schemes look like amateur mistakes, compared to the systematic destruction of his life that was about to begin. Wednesday morning, I assembled my team of professionals in the private conference room at Meridian Wealth Management to orchestrate what Elena Rodriguez called the most comprehensive financial justice operation she'd ever been asked to coordinate. Around the mahogany table sat the people who would help me deliver consequences that Vincent could never have imagined. Helena, Rebecca Torres from Blackstone Investigations, David Kim from Precision Financial Auditing, and 2 new additions that would ensure Vincent's downfall would be both swift and complete. The first new team member was Amanda Foster, a federal prosecutor who specialized in financial crimes and had taken a personal interest in Vincent's case after David Kim had presented our evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Amanda's presence transformed what could have been a personal vendetta into a legitimate federal investigation. "Mrs. Calloway," Amanda said, reviewing the comprehensive file we'd assembled, What your husband has done constitutes wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and racketeering under federal statutes. These aren't just civil matters, they're federal felonies that carry mandatory minimum sentences. But more importantly, his crimes have created a financial emergency that requires immediate intervention to protect other potential victims. The second new team member was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychologist who specialized in financial predators and their behavioral patterns. Dr. Warren's analysis of Vincent's actions had revealed a profile that was both disturbing and strategically valuable for planning our confrontation. Your husband exhibits classic patterns of a financial narcissist with sociopathic tendencies, Dr. Warren explained, spreading psychological assessment documents across the table. He's capable of elaborate deception, shows no genuine remorse for harming others, and becomes increasingly dangerous when his control is threatened. This means our approach must be carefully calibrated to prevent him from taking desperate actions that could harm you or destroy evidence. The team had spent the past week developing what Amanda called Operation Financial Justice, a coordinated strategy that would expose Vincent's crimes while protecting me from any potential backlash and ensuring maximum legal consequences for his actions. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its thoroughness. We would use Vincent's own psychological patterns against him, drawing him into a situation where he would voluntarily provide evidence of his crimes while believing he was manipulating me into returning to our marriage under his terms. Helena had orchestrated the financial components with precision that impressed even Amanda. We'd established monitoring systems for all accounts Vincent had access to, created legal barriers that would prevent him from disposing of assets once he realized he was under investigation, and positioned cryptocurrency experts to trace any attempts he might make to hide money in digital assets. Your husband's financial desperation makes him predictable, Helena explained, showing us transaction patterns that revealed Vincent's increasing panic over his business situation. He's been making increasingly erratic financial decisions, borrowing money at rates that suggest he's no longer thinking rationally about long-term consequences. Rebecca Torres had coordinated the investigative elements that would ensure we captured every aspect of Vincent's criminal behavior. Her team had installed sophisticated surveillance equipment that would document his reactions and statements during our planned confrontation, creating evidence that could be used in federal prosecution. We've positioned recording devices in locations where your husband conducts business and personal meetings, Rebecca explained, showing me technical specifications that demonstrated the thoroughness of her preparation. Every conversation he has over the next few days will be documented, including any attempts he makes to hide assets, intimidate witnesses, or coordinate with potential accomplices. But the most crucial element of our plan involved timing and psychological manipulation. Dr. Warren had identified specific triggers that would cause Vincent to reveal the full scope of his crimes while believing he was in control of the situation. Your husband's narcissistic personality means he cannot resist the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over someone he perceives as weak, Dr. Warren continued. If we create a scenario where he believes you're desperate to reconcile and willing to accept his financial control, he'll voluntarily explain his crimes as evidence of his cleverness and strategic thinking. The plan required me to contact Vincent and request a meeting to discuss reconciliation, positioning myself as the financially helpless woman he believed I was. During this meeting, Vincent would be encouraged to explain exactly how he'd been managing our finances and why his approach was superior to any alternative I might consider. Amanda had obtained federal warrants that would allow us to use any evidence Vincent provided during our conversation, as long as he offered the information voluntarily without coercion. The legal framework was designed to ensure that his confession would be admissible in federal court while protecting me from any claims that I'd enticed him into self-incrimination. The beauty of this approach, Amanda explained, is that your husband's own arrogance will provide the evidence we need to prosecute him effectively. Men like Vincent cannot resist the opportunity to demonstrate their supposed intellectual superiority, especially to women they've been manipulating. Helena had arranged for the meeting to take place in a location that would maximize Vincent's comfort and confidence while ensuring optimal recording quality for our surveillance equipment. The Grandview Hotel's executive meeting room had been reserved for Thursday afternoon, a setting elegant enough to make Vincent feel important while technically sophisticated enough to capture every word he spoke. But the most psychologically sophisticated element of our plan involved the financial bait we would offer Vincent. Dr. Warren had suggested that we present him with an opportunity to gain access to what he would perceive as my inheritance, but structured in a way that would require him to confess his previous financial manipulations. We'll tell your husband that you've inherited a substantial sum from your great-aunt, but that the inheritance lawyers require complete financial disclosure of your marital assets to complete the transfer, Dr. Warren explained. This will motivate him to voluntarily provide detailed confessions about his financial crimes, believing that honesty will give him access to money that could solve his business problems. The irony was perfect. Vincent would confess to years of financial fraud because he wanted access to the inheritance that would have made his crimes unnecessary. His greed and desperation would motivate him to provide evidence that would send him to federal prison for decades. Rebecca had coordinated with federal agents who would be positioned to arrest Vincent immediately after he finished confessing to his crimes. The timing would prevent him from having any opportunity to destroy evidence, flee the jurisdiction, or take any retaliatory action against me or other potential witnesses. Your husband will walk into that meeting believing he's about to gain control of substantial wealth, Rebecca concluded. He'll leave in federal custody, facing charges that will ensure he never has the opportunity to victimize anyone else financially. As our team finalized the operational details, I realized that Vincent's greatest strength, his absolute confidence in his ability to manipulate and control people, would become the instrument of his complete destruction. The same narcissistic arrogance that had convinced him he could steal from me for years without consequences would motivate him to confess everything to federal investigators. Dr. Warren had predicted that Vincent's psychological profile would make him incapable of resisting the opportunity to demonstrate his financial sophistication to someone he perceived as intellectually inferior. His need to prove his superiority would override any caution about self-incrimination. Thursday afternoon, Vincent would discover that the financially helpless woman he'd thrown out of his house had spent the past week assembling a team of federal prosecutors, forensic accountants, and criminal investigators who understood his psychology better than he understood it himself. The man who'd built his confidence on underestimating women was about to learn that his greatest victim had become his most formidable opponent. Thursday. Afternoon at 3:30 p.m., Vincent walked into the Grandview Hotel's executive meeting room with the confident stride of a man who believed he was about to regain control of his life. He wore his most expensive suit, the navy Armani I'd bought him for our 10th anniversary, and carried a leather briefcase that I knew contained the financial documents he thought would impress me with his business acumen. What Vincent didn't know was that every word he was about to speak would be recorded by federal surveillance equipment, that FBI agents were positioned throughout the hotel, and that the woman sitting across from him had spent the past week assembling evidence that would send him to federal prison for the next 20 years. Sophia, Vincent said, his voice carrying the patronizing warmth he'd perfected over 12 years of marriage. I'm glad you called. I've been hoping we could work through this misunderstanding like mature adults. I kept my expression neutral, channeling the advice Dr. Warren had given me about appearing vulnerable and dependent while maintaining enough composure to guide the conversation toward his confession. Vincent, I've been doing a lot of thinking since Tuesday night. Maybe you were right about my financial irresponsibility. The satisfaction that flickered across Vincent's face was exactly what our team had predicted. His narcissistic need for validation was already overriding any caution he might have felt about discussing his financial activities in detail. I appreciate you recognizing that, Vincent replied, settling into his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. Financial management requires discipline and expertise that most people simply don't possess. That's why our arrangement has worked so well. I handle the complex decisions while you focus on your artistic interests. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking, but I forced myself to nod appreciatively while preparing to deliver the bait that would trigger his confession. Actually, Vincent, that's part of why I wanted to meet with you today. Something has happened with Aunt Minerva's estate that I need your help understanding. Vincent's eyes sharpened with interest, and I could see him calculating the potential financial implications of whatever I was about to reveal. The estate attorneys contacted me yesterday, I continued, following the script our team had developed. Apparently, Aunt Minerva left me a substantial inheritance, but there are complications with the transfer that require complete financial disclosure of our marital assets. Vincent leaned forward, his business instincts fully engaged. What kind of inheritance are we talking about? The lawyers mentioned something about cryptocurrency holdings worth several $1,000,000, I said, watching Vincent's expression transform from polite interest to intense focus. But they need documentation of all our financial accounts, business interests, and asset transfers over the past 3 years before they can complete the probate process. The psychological trap was working exactly as Dr. Warren had predicted. Vincent's greed was overwhelming any caution he might have felt about disclosing his financial crimes. The prospect of gaining access to millions in cryptocurrency was causing him to view complete financial transparency as an opportunity rather than a threat. Sophia, this is incredible news, Vincent said, his voice carrying genuine excitement for the first time in months. Cryptocurrency inheritance is complex, but if we handle this properly, it could solve all our financial challenges. That's what I was hoping you'd say, I replied, maintaining my performance of grateful dependency. The attorneys need a complete picture of how we've been managing our finances. They want to understand every account, every business transaction, every way money has moved between our personal and professional obligations. Vincent's confidence was now completely overriding his judgment. The opportunity to demonstrate his financial sophistication while gaining access to cryptocurrency wealth was irresistible to his narcissistic personality. Of course they need complete disclosure, Vincent said, opening his briefcase and spreading documents across the table. Let me explain exactly how I've been structuring our financial arrangements to maximize efficiency and minimize tax liability. For the next 45 minutes, Vincent provided the most comprehensive confession to federal financial crimes that Amanda Foster had ever recorded. He explained in meticulous detail how he'd been forging my signature on loan documents, transferring money from my retirement accounts to cover business losses, and manipulating our tax filings to hide his criminal activities. You see, Sophia, Vincent said with the pride of someone demonstrating his cleverness, I've been using your credit and assets as collateral for business investments because your employment history doesn't generate the kind of creditworthiness that my ventures require. It's been a win-win arrangement. You get to benefit from the lifestyle my business success provides, while I get access to the financial resources necessary to build our wealth. The casual way Vincent described years of identity theft and financial fraud was staggering. He spoke about forging my signature as if it were a minor technical detail, about stealing from my retirement accounts as if it were prudent financial planning, about manipulating our taxes as if it were sophisticated wealth management. But Vincent's most damaging confession came when he began explaining his recent business difficulties and the strategies he'd implemented to address them. The past few months have required some creative financial engineering, Vincent continued, completely unaware that he was providing evidence for federal racketeering charges. I've been using new client deposits to fulfill obligations to existing clients while restructuring our debt obligations to maintain cash flow. It's a sophisticated approach that requires careful timing and strategic planning. Vincent was describing a textbook Ponzi scheme with the casual confidence of someone explaining routine business operations. His narcissistic certainty that he was demonstrating financial expertise was causing him to confess to crimes that would add decades to his potential prison sentence. The key to managing complex financial arrangements, Vincent concluded, is understanding that conventional rules don't apply when you're operating at the level of sophistication that my business requires. Most people can't handle this kind of strategic thinking. As Vincent finished his comprehensive confession to multiple federal felonies, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was the man I'd been married to for 12 years, someone I'd loved and trusted, revealing himself to be a criminal who'd spent years systematically victimizing me while convincing himself he was demonstrating financial genius. "Vincent," I said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about Aunt Minerva's inheritance." Before he could respond, the meeting room doors opened and FBI agent Sarah Martinez entered with 3 additional federal agents. Vincent's expression transformed from confident satisfaction to confused panic as he realized that his carefully planned financial demonstration had actually been a confession to federal investigators. "Vincent Calloway," Agent Martinez announced, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent." As the federal agents placed handcuffs on Vincent's wrists, he stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. The man who'd spent 12 years treating me like someone too intellectually limited to understand complex financial concepts was struggling to comprehend how his financially dependent wife had orchestrated a federal investigation that would destroy his life completely. "Sophia," Vincent whispered as the agents prepared to escort him from the room. "How did you know?" I looked at the man who'd thrown me out of our home for being financially worthless, and smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who'd just demonstrated exactly what underestimating the wrong woman would cost. "Vincent," I replied, "you forgot that the woman you married wasn't actually as helpless as you needed her to be." Within hours of Vincent's arrest, the carefully constructed empire he'd built through fraud and manipulation began collapsing with the speed and finality of a controlled demolition. By Friday morning, federal agents had executed search warrants at Callaway Strategic Consulting, our home on Elmhurst Drive, and 3 different bank locations where Vincent had maintained accounts under various business entities. Amanda Foster called me at 8:30 a.m. to provide the first update on what she described as one of the most comprehensive financial crime cases her office had processed in recent years. "Mrs. Calloway," Amanda's voice carried the satisfaction of a prosecutor who'd just secured irrefutable evidence against a dangerous criminal. "Your husband's confession yesterday has triggered a cascade of revelations that we never could have uncovered through traditional investigation methods. His own words have unlocked criminal activities that extend far beyond what we initially suspected. The search warrant execution at Vincent's office had revealed evidence of additional crimes that transformed his case from financial fraud to organized criminal enterprise. Hidden in his office safe, federal agents had discovered detailed records of a sophisticated money laundering operation that involved 5 other business owners in the tri-state area. Your husband has been operating as part of a network that was systematically defrauding clients, manipulating contracts, and moving illegal proceeds through cryptocurrency exchanges," Amanda continued. "The documentation we seized shows that his business was essentially a front for laundering money generated by invoice fraud, contract manipulation, and tax evasion schemes involving multiple companies. But the most devastating discovery came when federal forensic accountants analyzed Vincent's business computers and found evidence that he'd been blackmailing clients who'd unknowingly participated in his fraudulent activities. Vincent had been deliberately structuring contracts in ways that compromised his clients' legal standing, then using their vulnerability to extract additional payments and services. Your husband created a system where his clients became unknowing accomplices to his crimes, then leveraged their compromised position to maintain control over the business relationships," Amanda explained. "It's one of the most sophisticated criminal manipulation schemes we've encountered in corporate consulting." The scope of Vincent's criminal enterprise was staggering. Federal agents had identified at least 12 different businesses that had been victimized by his fraudulent consulting services, with total losses exceeding $2.3 million. But more shocking was the discovery that Vincent had been planning to expand his operation by recruiting additional consultants who would implement similar schemes in other regional markets. Elena Rodriguez called me an hour later with updates on the financial consequences that were devastating Vincent's carefully constructed lifestyle. Sophia, the federal asset seizure orders have frozen every account Vincent has access to, Helena reported, with professional satisfaction. His business accounts, personal credit lines, the mortgage on your home, his luxury car loans, everything has been placed under federal control pending criminal prosecution. The financial seizures were more comprehensive than I'd expected. Federal agents had identified shell companies in Delaware and Nevada that Vincent had established to hide assets from potential creditors and legal judgments. These companies had been used to purchase luxury items, make investments, and maintain financial reserves that Vincent had kept secret from me throughout our marriage. Your husband had been preparing for the possibility that his crimes would be discovered, Helena continued. He'd moved approximately $340,000 into accounts that he believed would be protected from seizure. Federal agents have now recovered all of those funds as evidence of money laundering and criminal asset concealment. But the immediate financial consequences were only the beginning of Vincent's problems. Rebecca Torres called me that afternoon with information about the professional and personal destruction that was spreading through Vincent's network like wildfire. Pemberton Industries terminated their consulting contract this morning and has initiated legal action to recover payments for services that weren't actually delivered, Rebecca reported. Advanced Analytics Solutions has contacted all of Vincent's remaining clients to offer emergency consulting services to help them understand their potential legal exposure from his fraudulent activities. Vincent's client base was disappearing overnight as companies realized they'd been unknowingly involved in criminal activities. The sophisticated business network he'd spent years building was being systematically dismantled by legal teams trying to minimize their clients' liability for crimes they hadn't known they were participating in. Your husband's professional reputation has been completely destroyed, Rebecca continued. The state licensing board has initiated proceedings to revoke his business certifications, and the Better Business Bureau has issued warnings about his fraudulent practices. No legitimate company will work with him again, even if he avoids prison time. Dr. Warren called me that evening to discuss Vincent's psychological state and the additional revelations that had emerged from interviews with his associates and employees. Your husband's arrest has triggered a complete psychological breakdown, Dr. Warren explained. He's been confronted with the reality that his self-image as a sophisticated financial strategist was actually delusion covering criminal incompetence. The cognitive dissonance is causing him to alternate between denying reality and providing additional confessions to federal investigators. Vincent's psychological collapse had led him to continue confessing to crimes even after his arrest, as he desperately tried to demonstrate that his criminal activities had been sophisticated rather than simply fraudulent. His narcissistic personality couldn't accept being perceived as a common criminal, so he kept providing evidence that would increase his prison sentence while trying to convince investigators that his crimes had been intellectually complex. Your husband has confessed to additional financial crimes involving tax evasion, insurance fraud, and securities violations that weren't part of our original investigation, Dr. Warren continued. His need to be perceived as clever is causing him to provide evidence that will add decades to his potential sentence. Amanda Foster's final call of the day provided the most satisfying update about Vincent's legal situation. Mrs. Calloway, your husband is facing federal charges that carry a potential sentence of 45 to 60 years in prison, Amanda reported. Given his age and the severity of his crimes, this effectively means he'll spend the rest of his life in federal custody. The charges against Vincent had expanded beyond our original evidence to include racketeering, conspiracy, securities fraud, and criminal enterprise operations. His confession had provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to pursue maximum sentences under federal guidelines. Your husband's decision to demonstrate his financial sophistication has resulted in one of the most comprehensive criminal confessions we've ever recorded, Amanda concluded. He's provided evidence that will not only convict him, but will also be used to prosecute his criminal associates and recover assets for his victims. But perhaps the most poetic justice was the discovery that Vincent's desperate attempts to maintain his lifestyle through criminal activities had been completely unnecessary. If he'd simply been honest about his business struggles and worked with me as an equal partner, we could have used my legitimate inheritance to solve his financial problems without destroying multiple lives. Instead, Vincent's need to maintain, control, and demonstrate superiority had led him to choose criminal fraud over honest partnership, resulting in consequences that would eliminate any possibility of the life he'd been trying to preserve. The man who'd thrown me out for being financially worthless was now facing decades in federal prison for crimes that had generated less money than I'd inherited legitimately from Aunt Minerva's cryptocurrency investments. Vincent had gambled everything on his ability to manipulate and control others, and he'd lost more completely than he could have imagined possible. 6 months after Vincent's sentencing to 52 years in federal prison, I stood in the penthouse office of my new headquarters building on Harbor Point Boulevard, watching the sunrise illuminate the city that had become the foundation of my transformed life. The woman who'd been thrown out of her own home for being financially worthless was now the CEO of Blackwood Digital Ventures, a cryptocurrency investment firm that managed over $800 million in assets and employed 47 people across 3 countries. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been as systematic and strategic as the investigation that had brought Vincent to justice. Working with Elena Vasquez and an expanded team of international financial advisors, I'd leveraged Aunt Minerva's inheritance into something far more powerful than simple wealth. I'd built an empire based on technological innovation and financial inclusion. The first major decision I'd made after Vincent's arrest was to purchase the building that had housed Callaway Strategic Consulting. The irony was perfect. The space where Vincent had conducted his fraudulent operations became the headquarters for a legitimate business that was revolutionizing how people accessed and understood cryptocurrency investments. But my business model was designed around principles that were the opposite of Vincent's approach. Instead of manipulation and control, Blackwood Digital Ventures focused on education and empowerment. We specialized in helping people who'd been excluded from traditional investment opportunities, women, minorities, and individuals who'd been victims of financial abuse, understand and access the wealth-building potential of digital assets. Mrs. Blackwood, my chief technology officer, Sarah Chen, called from across the office, using the name I'd legally reclaimed after my divorce was finalized. The quarterly impact report is ready for your review. The numbers are extraordinary. The impact report documented something I was more proud of than the financial returns our firm had generated. In 6 months, we'd helped over 2,400 people establish their first cryptocurrency investments, provided financial education to 15,000 individuals through our online platform, and created a scholarship program that had funded blockchain technology. Education for 127 women and minorities who couldn't otherwise afford technical training. Sarah, these numbers represent something more significant than business growth, I replied, reviewing the documentation that showed how many lives we'd changed through financial empowerment. Every person who learns to control their own financial future is someone who can never be victimized the way I was. The scholarship program had become particularly meaningful to me because it addressed the root cause of financial vulnerability: education and access to emerging technologies. Vincent had been able to manipulate me for 12 years because I'd trusted his expertise instead of developing my own. Now, hundreds of people were gaining the knowledge that would make them immune to similar manipulation. Elena Vasquez joined me at the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor, carrying news that would complete the transformation of my life in ways I'd never expected. Sophia, I've received the final documentation from the Federal Asset Recovery Program, Elena announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd helped orchestrate perfect justice. Vincent's criminal enterprise has generated 3.7 million in restitution payments that will be distributed to his victims. The federal investigation that had begun with Vincent's confession had ultimately recovered assets from 17 different criminal associates and shell companies. His arrest had triggered the dismantling of an entire network of financial fraud that had been operating across 6 states. But the most satisfying aspect of the recovery, Helena continued, is that Vincent's own assets, his cars, his luxury possessions, even his business equipment, have been sold to fund victim compensation. He's literally paying for the consequences of his own crimes. The poetic justice was perfect. Vincent had spent years accumulating possessions and status symbols through criminal activities, and now those same possessions were being liquidated to compensate the people he'd victimized. His BMW, his expensive suits, his Rolex watch, everything he'd used to project an image of success, was now funding recovery for families he'd financially destroyed. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Chen, the blockchain forensic specialist who'd helped me understand Aunt Minerva's technological legacy, called me with news that would cement my reputation in the cryptocurrency industry. Mrs. Blackwood, the International Blockchain Technology Association wants to offer you the Minerva Innovation Award for your contributions to cryptocurrency education and inclusion, Dr. Chen announced. It's the highest honor in our industry, and you'll be the youngest recipient in the award's history. The award wasn't just recognition for my business success. It was acknowledgement that I'd used my inheritance to advance the same values that Aunt Minerva had championed throughout her pioneering work in digital finance. The woman everyone had dismissed as an eccentric had actually been building technologies that would democratize access to wealth creation. Rebecca Torres contacted me that afternoon with the final update on Vincent's situation, information that provided closure on the chapter of my life that had ended with his arrest. Sophia, Vincent has been transferred to Federal Correctional Institution Coleman in Florida to begin serving his sentence, Rebecca reported. At age 46 with a 52-year sentence, he'll be eligible for release when he's 98 years old, assuming he lives that long. Vincent would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, surrounded by other white-collar criminals who'd believed they were too clever to face consequences for their actions. The man who'd treated me like an intellectual inferior was now completely powerless, dependent on a system that would control every aspect of his existence for the remainder of his days. Rebecca, I said, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness, I actually feel sorry for him. If he'd just been honest about his business problems, we could have worked together to build something legitimate and sustainable. But Vincent's need to maintain control and superiority had made honest partnership impossible. His narcissistic personality had required him to dominate and manipulate rather than collaborate and respect. The criminal path he'd chosen had been about psychology more than money. As evening approached, I walked through the offices of Blackwood Digital Ventures, observing the team of financial advisors, technology specialists, and education coordinators who were helping people around the world understand and access cryptocurrency investments. These weren't just employees. They were partners in a mission to democratize financial opportunity. The final element of my transformation was the most personal. That weekend, I would be moving into a waterfront mansion in Seaside Heights that I'd purchased not through inheritance, but with profits generated by my own business decisions and investment strategies. The home represented something Vincent had never been able to provide, security that I'd created through my own capabilities. The woman who'd been thrown out of her house for being financially irresponsible was now teaching thousands of people how to build generational wealth through emerging technologies. The person Vincent had called worthless was now managing nearly $1 billion in assets and employing dozens of people in meaningful, well-paying careers. But the most important lesson I'd learned wasn't about money or business strategy. It was about the difference between power derived from controlling others and power derived from empowering yourself. Vincent had built his confidence by diminishing mine. I'd built my empire by helping others build theirs. Today, when people underestimate women's financial capabilities or dismiss their understanding of complex technologies, I think about Aunt Minerva, who'd been building the future while everyone else was focused on the present. I think about the thousands of people who've discovered their own financial power through education and opportunity. And I think about Vincent, spending his days in a federal prison cell, finally learning what it means to be truly powerless while the woman he'd tried to control was reshaping the future of digital finance. The greatest revenge isn't destroying someone who's wronged you. It's becoming so successful that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Vincent's approval had once seemed essential to my happiness. Now, his existence was simply a reminder of how much I'd grown beyond needing anyone's permission to be extraordinary. Subscribe to this channel if you've enjoyed this journey of justice and transformation. Remember, in a world where financial knowledge is power, education is the ultimate revenge against anyone who's ever tried to control you through ignorance. The woman who was once financially worthless is now helping others discover they're financially priceless. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.